This is about the Soames Heritage Area. And is there anybody in this room who's ever heard Soames Heritage Area? Huh? You have. Good for you. Okay, that's nice, because my mission is to get everybody to learn about the Soames Heritage Area. I'm going to have to go back and forth like this to change slides. So if you're wondering where it is, this is a map of southern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Okay, that's Providence up there. Okay, I live in Warren, and there are 8 communities today who comprise the original home of the Massasoit Meeting. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about here. The little town of Warren. I lived there for about 40 years as a town hall, and in the frieze above town hall you will see Soames, and the depiction of an Indian. However, that's a Western Indian. No Indian who ever lived there ever had a headdress that looked like that. But that was 1888, and what did they know? Okay. This is where Osamequin. How many people have heard of the Massasoit, or you've probably heard Massasoit, and like that was his first name. Well, Massasoit is a title, like president. Okay, his name was Osamequin, which means yellow feather, but so much of recorded history just refers to him as Massasoit, including the people from Plymouth who were writing about him. But he really is the Massasoit, and I will try to use that terminology as we talk.
And Massasoit means what again?
A Massasoit is a title meaning basically chief of chiefs. Okay, he presided over about 31 tribes, each of whom had their own chief. Turns out that the Massasoit is now reburied behind my house. How convenient, I retired. And a month before I retire, they rebury him. I live in a house just in the corner of Burrs Hill Park in Warren. Okay? It's a nice flattened area here, but on this side are these kind of mound-looking areas. And on May 17th, 2017, members of the Mashpee tribe showed up with permission from the town and an excavator, and dug a hole there and reburied over 600 artifacts that had been taken from Burrs Hill in 1913 by the then town librarian Charles Carr. Charles was an amateur archaeologist, and he got tired of people stealing stuff from these grave sites over the years, particularly when the railroad came through one edge of the park, along the back edge of the park. They built a railroad in 1854, and they took gravel from this area to build the railroad bed. So they were constantly digging in there, and they would find bones and other artifacts from these graves, and people would, of course, take them home, and nobody, So Charles got very annoyed about that, got permission from the railroad, and dug up 42 native grave sites there, removed everything. Some of it went to his little museum in the town library, others went to Heffenrepfer at Brown and the Hay Museum of the American Indian in New York. Well, what Charles had found was the burial site from probably anywhere from about 1550 to 1660 or later. We don't really know for certain because there are no dates. They don't mark the graves, obviously. But from the artifacts, we have a pretty good idea of what was buried with people there. And Susan Gibson in 1980, the year I moved into my house, published a book where she traced all of the grave artifacts and learn their origin. With, you know, many things from Holland, others from England, all in these native grave sites. So it became clear that this was a native burial site for a tribe called the Pokanoket. How many people have heard the Pokanoket tribe? Oh, good. That's another thing I'm working to get people to change their terminology from Wampanoag. We all hear Wampanoag. It was the Wampanoag who met the Pilgrims. Well, that term wasn't used till after 1700, when the term Pokanoket could not be uttered by any human being after the King Philip War, or you'd be shot on sight if you were over 12 years old, age or older. Okay? So that was an attempt to expunge the Pokanoket tribe, who were involved principally in the King Philip War in 1675-76, and the English did not want to hear the language spoken, or did not want to see the people anymore. So there was really a genocidal effort to get rid of the Pokanoket tribe. So one of the ways you do that is give them another name, and that name is Wampanoag. The Mashpee tribe, primarily on the Cape, is the one who promotes Wampanoag, but they will, if you talk to them, they'll say, oh yes, we include the Pokanokets, okay, but you rarely hear that name. So here we are. Here's another version of this map. I'll leave this here. This is a map of Indian localities produced by Tom Bicknell in 1908. He went back and found all the native names for the land in Soames, which was the home of the Massasoit, translates loosely as the southern area. Okay. This was only a part of the Pokanoket tribal lands, which extended almost up to Boston there in the yellow map, and included Providence, because I originally thought Providence was Narragansett. Well, it was Pokanoket until the Narragansetts moved in, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that happened. But here are the major tribes. Translate Wampanoag as Pokanoket, the Massachusetts tribe, the Nipmuc, and the Narragansetts. You all heard of the Pequots, right? Because of the casino, right? So, for 10,000 years, people were living in this area, okay? Peacefully and rather successfully, as far as we know. I mean, there may have been tragedies of one sort or another, but there's no recorded history of that. But the fact that these people were able to live sustainably, okay, without ruining their environment. We've been here 400 years. How are we doing? Think about it. Okay. So, about 100,000 people lived in New England. In the 1500s, people started showing up on large floating islands that we know as ships, and began trading. Okay? So there's a lot of activity going on between native people and the Europeans up until 1620, primarily around trade. We'll learn one of the consequences in a second, but that trade never resulted in colonization. What was different when the Mayflower arrived was that they brought women and children. So when Osamequin and his warriors observed this landing in December, they were aware of what was going on. They kept their distance and did not interfere with what was going on until they met with them the following March, because they were concerned about two things. What was the intention of this group coming with women and children that's different from traders, okay? And secondly, they had just experienced 3 years of the most devastating illness you can imagine. Okay? We don't know exactly what it was, whether it was scarlet fever, smallpox, the plague. It's very uncertain as to what it was, and it could very well have been a series of diseases. But one thing we do know from the written accounts is that 90% of that population died. So many people died, there weren't people left to bury the dead, So when the pilgrims arrived, they found bones on the ground. Well, back then, not knowing anything about infectious disease and never having seen quite an event like that, what was their interpretation? God has prepared us the way, because here's a complete village without people. Okay, and that's what they moved into. Even though by March of the following year they'd lost half of their population through their own illnesses. Well, there was a famous meeting that's recorded March 22nd, 1621, when Osamequin brought 60 of his warriors and met, and through the interpreter, Samoset, were able to strike an agreement. And the agreement basically says, we won't harm you, you don't harm us, and we'll protect each other from our common enemies, all right?
Okay.
A pretty decent agreement.
So how did they speak with each other?
Through Samoset, who had been captured by some of the traders several years before, taken to England, and he learned English. So he came back to his village of Patuxet, what we know as Plymouth, found everyone he knew dead, okay, and then saw these strange people from England who he could talk with. So he became the translator, and they were able to arrange this agreement, known as the Wampanoag Treaty. Here's the 6 points of the treaty. I won't go over those in detail, but this treaty, we all heard about the Mayflower Compact, which was written on board the ship because you had separatists, religious separatists, and then a whole bunch of other people who weren't terribly religious, and they had to get along, so they worked out the compact. But this treaty is far more important because it led to the survival of the pilgrims for the next 50 years. It's celebrated in the Wampanoag Treaty coin. How many people have seen this? Yeah, none of you, right? Because it's on the back of the Sacagawea coin, okay? And no one ever turns it over. Okay? And what you'll see written there is the Wampanoag Treaty, and it's really the Pokanoket Treaty. I've worked with the tribe a lot today, and they say, why did they name it Wampanoag? In any case, that's the only federal recognition of that treaty that I know of, okay? It's just gone, and that's why I'm here to tell you this story. Ed Winslow, stalwart separatist who came aboard the Mayflower, became their diplomat, if you will, decided that after meeting with Osamequin in March, that in June or possibly early July, he would come down to Osamequin's home in Solms. So he walked from Plymouth to Warren, or some say Barrington, Rhode Island, about 40 miles, okay, nice summer day according to this written description, and had a nice meeting with him. And you can read all about that, it's written in Mort's Relation. He may have met at the spring that's called the Massasoit Spring on Baker Street in Warren. We don't know for sure, and there's a lot of speculation about exactly where did they meet. It really doesn't matter. It's well recorded that they did meet there and then. 2 years later, Osamequin becomes ill. No one knows why for sure, but Ed Winslow hears about this back in Plymouth and decides he's going to go down there again. So he gets another party with John Hamden and others, and a guide, a native guide, and they come down. Basically, it's walking from Plymouth to the headwaters of the Taunton River and then working your way down. There are people who have tried to recreate that journey, and you can do so if you want to speculate. When Winslow arrives, he finds that Osamequin is on his deathbed. He's blind, ill with some kind of abdominal stress, let's put it that way. And it's well described, again, in his account of that occasion. So he whips up some English concoctions. You know, there were no doctors then, and if you were the head of a party that is coming across the Atlantic, you become the doctor. So Winslow gives him what he thought might be curative. He scrapes his tongue, one thing or another, sends for a chicken to be brought from Plymouth so they could make some chicken soup. Never got there. But Osamequin recovers, gets his eyesight back, feels better, gets up, walks around, and embraces Winslow and says, "We will be friends for life." And that was true. He kept his word. So, I show this to people who live around there because this is a Google map with all the current houses and boatyards and everything else removed to show you probably what the land looked like at the time. I first thought it would be full of virgin forest with large trees. Not so. The native people would burn the woods twice a year and kept the land open. Why do you want open land? Well, two reasons. It's easier to hunt and it's easier to travel. So, and they grew crops, not in large tracts, but that would be helpful as well. The English decided to open a trading post, probably in what's Barrington now, in 1632. That's the Hoxie house that you can find. There's no picture of the trading post from 1632. But all this open land, the English found to be exceptional. This area was just what they were looking for because where did they come from? England, with where all the trees were cut and denuded, okay? But this large open farmland, perfect for their crops and their livestock, okay? Here's our good friend Myles Standish. He was kind of the military leader from the separatists on the Mayflower. And he's quoted as saying that Solmes is the garden of the patent. The patent is what's given by the king so they could occupy the land. And the flower, and he spelled it F-L-O-U-R, good English spelling at the time of the patent. So he basically said, this is terrific real estate. I want some of it, and bought some of it. Another well-known person, Roger Williams, I won't go into the whole story there, but when he came over from England in 1631, went down to Plymouth and spent almost 2 years down there until they kicked him out, and you know why. He didn't have the same religious viewpoints and political viewpoints. So he goes back up to Salem, preaches there for a short time, and they decide, this guy's got to leave. We're shipping him back to England, okay? So he receives notice of that in January of 1636 and decides, I'm not going back to England. He goes back down to Plymouth and to Solmes to meet his old buddy, Osamequin, who he got to know when he was in Plymouth, okay? So they were friends, and because Roger was one of the few people who took the trouble to learn the language, if you haven't seen his Key to the Languages of America, it's a fabulous little book, and you'll learn a lot. But he had this arrangement, came down to Osamequin, and Osamequin said, you need a place to settle. First of all, we'll take care of you, because he was deathly ill, having traveled in the worst winter of the time, in January, walking over 60 miles, okay? So he needed some care, and Osamequin took him to his winter camp, which is just in Swansea, just over the Warren line, and sheltered him in what's known as Margarets Cave. The Williams family comes there every couple of years, and you would be able to visit it, except it's on private property, but I lead tours there, so see me if you're interested. We're going to do one shortly. And that was that winter encampment where Roger recovered over a 14-week period of time until he was well enough to then go up to what's now East Providence to a place called Omega Pond. Okay? You can find the marker for the place that Roger Williams first settled in 1636, but it's impossible to locate because it's a little marker way back off the road and a little tiny sign and nobody knows anything about it. So I'm working on getting a proper historical marker right at the curbside so people will learn. There's also the two oldest houses in East Providence. And Roger was able to stay there for a couple of months until June. He got there in April, and by June he receives word from Plymouth, "You're on our land, you gotta leave," okay? So he and his clan, he brought his family down from Salem, had to remove across the river, and that's the famous meeting with Canonicus, the chief of the Narragansetts, who met him and said, "What cheer, ye top?" meaning friend, and he came and settled the city of Providence. Well, what's the city now? It was actually described as the cesspool of New England when he was there, because that's where all the rogue people went. Anybody who the Mashpee colony didn't like came to Rhode Island. Ann Hutchinson is probably the one you've heard of most, but there are all kinds of guys and women who came there who had different ideas about the role of the state and religion. Okay, so Roger wasn't the only one, but he wrote a lot about it. Had this little settlement in what's now Providence along the Massasoit River. It's all, of course, been filled in. If you get a chance, go to the Roger Williams Memorial when you're in Providence. It'll only take half an hour. It's right there on North Main Street, easy to find, not far from Route 95. I swear you can pull off on 95, go see this, and be back on 95 in an hour, okay? It's not a big deal, but in the interpretive center you'll get a better idea of what went on there. And that's the location of the spring that he found where he located the town. There's also the oldest bridge in Providence, though that doesn't look very old. That bridge was from 1660. It's the 8th version of the bridge. And guess who was the toll taker when they built that bridge in 1660? Roger Williams, okay? Have to make a living somehow. I began finding all kinds of evidence of the 17th century around there. In East Providence, Newman Church, settled in 1643, with a terrific cemetery right across the street for all your genealogy people. If you know the Carpenter family, this is the place to go. That church is very vibrant today, and we're going to get some interpretive signage out in front of that. Not far from there in East Providence is Hunts Mills, the location of the East Providence Historical Society, but along the 10-mile river were built a whole number of mills in the 1600s. Okay, that's what the English needed to do to produce the things they had to have. And they laid out a whole setting in East Providence called the Ring of the Green, where there was a huge mile-long common area. Everybody had frontage on that, and then on the back end of your farm you had connections to the rivers, either the 10-mile or the Seekonk River. So pretty good setup. Worked well until the King Philip War, and you'll find out why. Not far from there, also in this whole area was called Rehoboth. Rehoboth got split into then Seekonk and then at East Providence. So without moving, you could be in three towns and 2 states. If you look around in Rehoboth, go through the woods, you'll find these markers for garrison houses. They had a mill as well there. It's a fascinating area that hardly anyone knows about. I lived there for 37 years and never found any of these places till I went looking. Here's what was going on by 1675. This is now Bristol. This is Warren, where I live now, Barrington, East Providence, and Swansea over here. But if you look at the native settlements, the original ones, and they vacated this one with a land sale in 1653. Then you look at the English settlements in yellow, okay? And we don't have the ones down in Newport and Portsmouth, okay? But if you have that whole map, what you see is a shrinking native population and land area. and an expanding population and land area for the English over that period of time, from the time of that original treaty in 1621 until 1675. And I won't go into the details on this, but basically the Pokanokets were not only just sick and tired of the English, but really threatened to the point that they thought they would lose their entire culture. That it wouldn't be long before the 700 of them who were remaining in the Bristol Peninsula would also be gone, and that would be it. Well, when you're threatened with that kind of depopulation, one response is to go to war. And that's what Osamequin's son, Metacomet, it's actually second son, now known as King Philip, because he took the name King Philip because he wanted to be parallel with King Charles. If you're in charge, you're the king, right? So he got the English name King Philip. He allied with the Nipmucks, if you remember them, and said, we're going to drive the English back home. So how many of you have seen King Philip War sites in western Massachusetts? Absolutely. You can go all the way up to New Hampshire. Okay, they went as far as Deerfield. Okay, burning over 25 English villages. Okay, and completely to the ground, and others that partially. And people actually began going back to England. Those who didn't went down to Newport because that was basically Narragansett land at the outbreak of the war. And they almost succeeded. Had they had a little more food and a little more ammunition in the spring of 1676, they could have prevailed, especially if they got the Mohawks involved. The Narragansetts had already joined them, and after the December massacre at Great Swamp, where 400 to 600 of them, men, women, and children, were burned alive. Okay, that didn't set well with the Narragansetts, so they sided in this effort, and for 14 months attempted to get their land back, basically, and their culture, more importantly. But Benjamin Church, who was recruited, he knew the Ashawonk and the native people down in Little Compton. He was recruited as their military leader when the Mashpee colony sent their militia down. And initially, Church starts with the standard method of warfare in English, with English armies. What do? You stand, march, stop, load, shoot, you know. Well, while you're doing that, the native people are picking you off from the trees on the side, okay? Well, he finally got smart in the beginning of 76 and began to adopt a more guerrilla warfare and actually allied with a number of, you know, it's not like all native people on one side and all English are on the other. There were people on both sides mixing there. But he had enough friendly native people who helped show his troops how you fight effectively. And in fact, as the native people were running out of food and ammunition, the English prevailed. Basically chased Philip back to his homeland at Mount Hope, and he was shot, not by Church. Church was with a guy named John Alderman, who was a praying Indian, who actually shot Philip, partly out of revenge that Philip had already had his brother murdered, so kind of payback, I guess. So that war came to a halt, at least down here. It didn't up in Maine. It went on for several years. This is the map of the territory there. This is him having been shot. But right after that war, that's what I was telling you, that native people were not permitted to exist, if you will. Many were enslaved, some sent to Barbados, because if you enslave a native person and they want to escape, what do they need to do? Just leave, okay? They know how to survive, and they know other tribes that will take them in. So if you want to have an enslaved person, you take a native person, ship them down to Barbados, trade them for an African person who doesn't know the language or the geography and can't survive on their own, and bring them up. So slavery began right at the end of the war there in a fairly large way. And those of you who have gotten into that whole slavery record, you need to understand that it wasn't just African Americans. There were a lot of Native Americans who were enslaved as well. You can go in Swansea, you'll find the marker for the Myles garrison where the English troops first arrived 3 days after the first shot was fired in the King Philip War. If you go on Brown property and get permission from the Mount Hope farm, you can find the marker where Philip was not only shot, but drawn, quartered, and his head hung on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. Okay? As a warning, to any other Native Americans, don't do this. Okay? Anawan Rock in Rehoboth is the site where Anawan, which was Philip's lieutenant, was finally captured by Church. He was then sent to Plymouth, and Church thought, they wouldn't execute him, but 3 days later he was hung. So that war left all kinds of marks. You can see evidence in some of the cemeteries in the area. My favorite is the Little Neck Cemetery in East Providence that includes the gravesite of Elizabeth Tilley, Howland. Okay, if you've been to Plymouth, you'd go to the Howland house. Well, and the whole Howland family. She has a fabulous story. Somebody's got to make a movie of her life, because she came over on the Mayflower at the age of 12, married John Howland, from the Mayflower itself, grew up all through that time in Plymouth, went through the King Philip War, and then finally settled after her husband died and lived in East Providence with her sister until she died. She's buried there, and it would make a fabulous story because of what she's seen. You'll find John Myles' gravesite, other gravesites. If you're down there sometime, actually all you need to do is go on the website, because all of this stuff, everything I'm saying is right here. Okay? Over 100 pages on this website, pictures, maps, everything you need to know, and you can come down and do a tour of the area. Okay, and I've got 10 tours now. I'm working with the Rhode Island. See what you get into when you get into history. I'm now a tour guide. I'm like, how to get there? So, a little more evidence of what was left over from the 17th century. A couple of beautiful farms, and this guy here, Byron Key in Warren, in Twisted area of Warren, keeps digging up Indian artifacts there, and I try to get him to properly return them to the tribe, but he wants to keep them, and it's legal. It's on his property. Beautiful areas that still evidence what life must have looked like 400 years ago. And part of this project is the environmental protection of those areas. The more people know about their history, the more likely they are to be informed about its preservation, right? So we have a big job to do to teach people about their history. And there was just an effort in Barrington to build new housing on the original settlement area of John Myles from 1663, where the first Baptist church in Massachusetts was built, and around which there were all kinds of houses. We haven't had an archaeological dig there. We'd love to do it. The land is privately owned, and until we put a stop to it, that land was going to be bulldozed and turned over into a nice modern housing development, right? That's what we all want, right? All our historic areas should be bulldozed, right? I don't hear a groundswell of support. If you drive through Swansea into Warren on Route 136, you'll go by this rock up here, and across the street this rock over here. This is King's Rock. is a large rock outcropping where native women would grind their corn by rolling a rock in a groove. You can walk up there and see the groove there. You can find out a little bit more about it in Tim Johnson's market right next door. He owns that half of the rock and is very much now interested in doing some historical interpretation there. So we're going to get a sign put up there, and also point across the street on another private farm. Does that look like a common boulder? Do you see a lot of boulders like that around? Okay. Does anybody know what that's called? That's a perched rock or a balanced rock. And you notice how it's on a piece of granite outcropping. And you'll notice a little stone right there propping it up. Actually, there's several stones propping it up. So I go to our state archaeologist and I say, hey Tim, tell me about this perched rock up there. Oh, that's a glacial erratic. Glacial erratic, yeah, you know, the glaciers deposit large stones. I said, but Tim, do glaciers put little stones underneath? He says, well, I don't know. You know, could have been a bunch of college kids. Who knows, you know? He says, well, some historic reference, I can't say. Okay, I get it. So I'm saying that balanced rock is up on Sachem's Knoll, a place that's recorded as where Indians had held their gatherings, okay? And it's not far from Margaret's Rock, the winter encampment, okay? It's just a quarter mile away, okay? So I've got this whole area now identified, you know, and now I need to interpret that history to the 6,000 to 10,000 people who drive by it every day and have no idea what they're driving by, okay? Other places behind the Town Hall in Swansea, this is the King Philip's seat up in Mount Hope in Bristol on Brown land, but the Pokanokets are trying to get their sacred land back from Brown, and we're starting a Friends of the Pokanoket group if you want to join that effort. This is up in Untold Hill. Anybody heard of Untold Hill? I never did. It's the western boundary of the city of Providence. It's a 300-foot hill on the Johnston border. Nice walk up there, and you can see the whole city from there. Here's Bristol in its early form. Bristol was laid out in 1680 after the war. Okay, war booty. All right, this was Philip's original homeland, but after the war, guess what? We take your land. Okay, no treaty, nothing. So they acquired the land in 1680, and by 1684 had laid out really the only English-style grid in Rhode Island for street layouts, or north-south, and you know, the whole thing like that. But then the land was sold to English proprietors to recover money to pay for the war effort. Okay, you can still see the oldest house in Bristol from 1680. Built with wood brought over from England, because they could mill it there and then bring it over and could put the house together. That's right on the main road, and unfortunately it's privately owned. Very few people know anything about it. So we've got an interpretive marker going up hopefully this fall. That was the first meeting house in Bristol, built after there's, you know how, just to establish a town back then, first you had to have a minister. To get a minister, you had to have a parsonage, and then once you got the minister and the parsonage, then you could build a meeting house, and once you had a meeting house, then you could have a town government, because the religious and governmental operations were essentially one and the same. Yep.
That was true in Rhode Island?
It was true in Bristol, yeah.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, oh, because of Roger?
Yeah.
No.
And the Rhode Island Constitution.
Yeah, no, no.
The franchise was limited
Right,
to
yeah.
church members.
It was true in it wasn't true in Providence. Roger really didn't have a lot to say about every other town and how it was
I
established.
see, thank you.
Yeah, but good point. Here are some of the items from the 1680s from that original church, including some of the pastors that were buried, and communion chalice brought over from England, and a pew end, and one thing or another. Here's some of the 17th century houses in Bristol. There's only 3 of them prior to 1700. Here are some of the houses from around the area. This one is in Warren, privately owned. Hunt House in Seekonk, privately owned, privately owned, privately owned. Oh, but you can go visit the Martin House in Swansea. They do nice tours. Great thing to do on a Sunday afternoon between now and the end of September. Okay, $5 donation will get you in anytime between 1 and 5 in Swansea. Not hard to find. Go on the website and you'll get all the information you need. So here we are back at Osamequin's burial site. This is the tribe celebrating the return of those grave items after not quite 400 years. Over 600 items buried in a sealed vault underground with that marker over the top.
Is that his signature? on the
Yes, yes.
Is
You
that-
look at this marking here.
Is that public land?
That's a public park, yeah,
Yeah.
anybody can go there. I'm hoping at some point to start an event. I want to start celebrating Ed Winslow's visit from 1621. We've got a little thing going on next year in Plymouth. Does anybody know what that is?
400.
Yeah, there you go. So I'm not going to compete with that. But they don't have anything after December of 20. So I'm going to see if we can't be the next place that people want to go in 2021. You all come down here to Burrs Hill Park and we'll have a big celebration, and our Pokanoket folks will be there, and I'm trying to see if we can get the Half Moon, the replica ship of Henry Hudson. Yeah, you know, that one's in the Hudson River. It's been up once before, and I know a guy who knows the guy, and if we can get that up, then we can recreate the 1623 incident with Osamequin's sickness. Remember that Ed Winslow cured, because there's a theory that what he was ill with was botulism. Now, where does botulism come from? Improperly stored food, okay? Well, where would you get improperly stored food? Oh, maybe from a Dutch trading ship that had just run aground a few feet from your house. Okay, interesting theory I ran across. Who knows? So, you can meet members of the tribe today. This is the tribal leader, the Sagamore. Bill Guy is his name. I talk with him every few days.
I'm curious, and probably a long answer, but you could do a short one. If they were sold into slavery and sent otherwhere,
Yep.
how is it they managed to hang on to what they believe today is their culture?
Right.
Their
Not easy when
songs,
you're
their-
exterminated, right?
Exactly.
Well, people have moved back into the area. They're
Who
now
held on to oral traditions.
oral traditions and family. Remember,
family.
tribal stuff is all about who you're related to.
Yeah.
Okay, forget
So
Elizabeth
even though
Warren,
they
it's not
dispersed,
DNA.
they held on to stories, they held on to
Yes, right.
inter-
And speaking of DNA, they've gone to Barbados and found DNA from the tribe down there. So they know this is, connections. But Bill's family actually came up to Connecticut, and it's only recently, in the last 20 years, moved into Barrington. But they're about 250 Pokanoket tribal members. They do a Starberry Moon Thanksgiving every June. Just had another one in Bristol. They do that on the grounds of Mouthwood Farm. So. Other questions?
Were there tribal members probably hiding in plain sight the way that?
Oh, all the time. Yep. If
Or
you,
they were probably
In the woods,
Right.
they went into the woods.
well, that, but if you could pass,
pretending to be
Yeah.
white people.
right, yeah. And through intermarriage and one thing, so a lot of people kind of disappeared, if you will.
So it sounds like you work closely with the native
Yes,
peoples, and it's, the natives that I know, the native peoples that I know are very hostile about this time period. So how do your contacts feel about that? Are they,
well, let's put it this way. You don't feel good when you're almost exterminated, okay? And one of the problems, I thought when I started working with the tribe that I would find all this, their own oral history. Turns out they lost all of that. When 90% of your population dies, that means all your historians, your storytellers, everybody who knows anything, okay, you've lost all of them. So, and then when you're, punished and expelled for being a tribe member, you lose all of that. So I'd say 95% of their history comes from the English history. It's the only record they have. It's their interpretation of the English history that's a little different than what you normally hear, right? Yep.
Couple of things. When did they, when were horses introduced?
Not long after, I don't have any record of anything prior to 1630, but when remember the Great Migration in 1630, when 1,000 people from England came to Boston.
Exactly.
Okay, imagine that, 1,000 people. I believe there were horses then. Of course, you know the story of the horses. The horses really originated in North America 23,000 years ago, and then first nobody knows, they died out. And it wasn't until the Spanish brought horses in the 1500s that the native people, particularly in the Southwest, had horses. But those, they didn't get to New England. Yeah.
I think you're right about the horses coming with Winthrop. There were 7 passenger ships and 4 freighters.
There you go.
And
Right.
they brought a lot of stuff.
They brought a lot of stuff, and they brought livestock. And
Yes.
what was interesting was, you got this clash of two worlds. In the native world, you don't own land. It's sacred. The land is part of you, and it's God's land. You don't sell it. Yeah.
That's not what Roger Williams.
Well, I know,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. But I'll say a little bit more about that. But and you don't own animals. What a bizarre thing that people come with these animals they've never seen before. They call cattle dogs because it's the closest thing they know. And these people were feeding their animals, What happened to hunting? Okay. And of course, the native people would see a cow out in the field and shoot it, saying that's a wild animal, I mean, it's two different ways of understanding things. And of course, the English, they live on the land, not with the land. And they constantly need more and more and more of the land. And then, of course, their animals would go, and the pigs in particular would just devastate any plantings that were done by the native people. So they're constantly in conflict, and that's a whole series of things that led to the King Philip War. This idea that you build a permanent structure and live in, and then bring all your resources to that structure. Okay, your farmhouse, okay, as opposed to the native successful for 10,000 years way of doing things of you move to where the resources are. Okay, so they had the Weetus, the light transportable houses, okay, it would take them from place to place. So they, this idea of where did the Massasoit live? What town was he in? Well, that wasn't any permanent town. He was all over southern New England. According to, when the fish were running and when the deer were plentiful and all that. Yeah. Other questions? We've got to finish here.
In Connecticut, in New London, whoever, Pokanoket or the Pequot, or whatever you want to call these people,
Well,
were there, and there's an English fort you can visit,
yes,
where John Winthrop's son was the general who killed the Indians
right,
in
yeah.
Connecticut.
The King Philip War was all the way in, all the way over that
Connecticut,
area,
too.
right. And if you really get into all the details about the history there were early conflicts. I mean, the Pequots were almost wiped out in 1637, the year after Roger Williams arrives in Rhode Island. So there were instances, and I hesitate to paint. The English weren't all bad, and the Indians weren't all good. Okay, there were tribes, the Pequots in particular, that the other tribes didn't like and hated. Okay, and there's a lot of mixture of things. Okay, it's not like the cultures finally merged or something of that sort, but there were native people who spent a lot of time with the English, and some English people who not only spent more time with the native people, some of them left native life and joined the tribes, okay? So you have all of that going on. It's a fascinating period of time in the 1700s, and one that I hope no matter what your other interests are, you'll take a little time to get interested. Let me stop now so you can get to what you need to go to, and if you've got any more questions, I'll be happy to answer. And visit the website.